Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. We are very thrilled and honored to have with us today Rachel Richardson of MacFarlanes in London. After serving 12 years as a finance lawyer with MacFarlanes, in early 2022, she was named head of ESG. And we're going to learn more about that during our conversations with Rachel today. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Pam.
We're so excited to have you here. So let's start with this role at MacFarlanes. Your title is Head of ESG. What does that mean?
Well, it means lots of things, and it means different things in different contexts and in different law firms as well. But I'll start by saying I think I've got one of the best jobs in the city. As head of ESG, and as other heads of ESG will also experience, you really do get to work with everyone in the firm, every sector, every team. The work streams are incredibly broad. And there's not that many other roles that truly do intersect with every team and every industry like that. Things are changing really rapidly in the world of ESG. And so every single day is different, and there is never a dull day because there's always something new to talk about. That brings challenges too. But in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis, some of the more granular things, I look at things like our ESG strategy, what we should be doing for clients, how we can serve them better from an ESG perspective in our legal work. And I will do things like education for clients, so helping educate them in relation to ESG, as well as internally at the firm. But a really big piece of it is the horizon scanning piece. So looking at what's coming down the track for our clients. In the UK, as of January, Chris Skidmore, who's an MP in the UK, he released his net zero review, which was where they were tasked with looking at net zero in the UK, how we might hit our target and how we might take advantage of the economic opportunities that net zero presents. And so for me, that involves digesting it, looking at the public policy recommendations, predicting what might become law or new financial products for our clients, and making sure that we keep clients aware and that we are adapting as we should be to the changes that might follow. And then there's the slightly less exciting stuff, such as pitching and managing the different ESG groups in the firm, and looking at the different ESG subgroup strategies and some ESG bits of work for clients that might relate to larger matters or might be independent, isolated pieces of advice too. So that's a little snapshot.
And so what do you do in your spare time? just kidding. So tell me how this role came to be at MacFarlanes, and does it include the internal ESG function at MacFarlanes as well as the external, or is this a different role?
It's a great question. So we have had the role of head of ESG at MacFarlanes for nearly 2 years now. It's been its current form for a few months. My predecessor did a fantastic job as head of ESG prior to me. And at that point, the role, I suppose the role more generally across the city was being established, and everyone was trying to work out what it should entail. And firms, I think, still have slightly different approaches. But in the beginning for the role, it covered both ESG and our legal advice and the implications for our clients, and also the firm's sustainability strategy and the firm's sustainability journey. So originally, it covered both. We changed that, and I think that's for the better. I'm a lawyer, and I think I'm best placed to cover ESG in legal advice and ESG and legal and regulatory change and those work streams that flow from it and the implications for clients. But I think also it's quite important. We've now established a head of sustainability role. So my colleague Praveen Gopalan takes that role. He's taking that role forward. And his role involves developing the firm's sustainability policies and the approach to that. Now, all of that said, I am also involved in some of the work that our head of sustainability leads on, because I don't believe that you can have ESG advice to clients without having an ESG embedded strategy within the firm. I think they're just two sides of the same coin. One goes hand in hand with the other. I should say separately, we have a diversity and inclusion team that sits slightly separately, but is of huge importance to us as a firm.
And just out of curiosity, where did you find your head of sustainability? Because I often get this question from my law firm clients. How do we find the people that can help us to do this?
Yeah, it was actually fairly difficult to recruit. We found him from another law firm, but I think the pool of people to look for is actually very, very slim. And I think there will be people needing to pivot from other roles to sort of fill the gaps that are out there. And our clients have the same challenges, actually.
Mm-hmm. I think the additional challenge for law firms, though, is it's a special find to find somebody who has the ESG expertise and also understands how law firms function.
Yes.
and are structured, because it's not your typical corporate structure. So getting somebody that has both of those skills is a real find. So kudos to you.
Yes, we're lucky. Yes, thank you.
What do you see as the highest area of interest around ESG from your clients?
Yeah, that's a pretty difficult question to answer, actually. For us, there's the really obvious ESG regulation that's coming in for us and the legal change that's going on. We've got quite a lot going on in the UK at the moment. We've got things like mandatory TCFD reporting coming in waves according to client type and size. So there's that, and the FCA are bringing through other pieces of regulation. So there's that's the really obvious one. But I suppose that the bit more interesting ones are things like the voluntary strategic decisions that clients are making to get a sort of competitive advantage, or ways that they're doing business slightly differently that relate to ESG. So, for example, I know B Corp didn't originate in the UK; it originated in the US, as I understand it. But it's very, very popular in the UK at the moment, and that requires a change to your constitutional documents and the way that you run your business, and the different obligations on directors change. So it's pretty big change. We have a lot of interest in relation to that, and I suppose purpose more generally, and how that feeds into how clients are run. And then there's other new strategic decisions being made, such as new impact strategies, and looking at different ways that perhaps funds and other client types can deliver both the financial return that investors expect and also the impact return as well. And then out there's a very broad spectrum of other new different financial products that relate to ESG, which we could go down a rabbit hole and spend hours talking about, but we'll save that for another podcast perhaps.
Your comments about B Corp are interesting. Is that one of the service lines that MacFarlanes offers its clients? Like, we can help you with your B Corp application or process to get a bit.
I mean, our advice is relatively focused on the legal change. Yes. And through doing that, we have experience of the process that we can share with our clients. But I think our focus is on the legal change.
Yes. What about the political pushback around ESG? Certainly, I think it's stronger here in the US, but you're likely seeing and experiencing some of it in the UK as well. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, and although we are a London-based law firm, virtually everything we do has an international aspect to it, and we are very connected to what goes on in the US as well, as you probably know. So we are also impacted by that too. I suppose. As an English lawyer, rather than being based in the US, I wouldn't want to specifically comment on US politics. But my own personal opinion is that these matters just aren't going to go away, regardless of what certain people think. I think it's important to listen to a range of views, always. And there might be better ways that we can do things. But the World Economic Forum every year, as you probably know, they produce their global risks report. The top 6 of those risks for 2023 out of a list of 10, all related to ESG in some way. That's the top 6. And that covered things like the climate crisis itself, biodiversity loss, and things that then derive from those issues. And those issues are fundamental risks to the economy and the way that we do business. And central banks and regulators are they just can't possibly ignore them, and neither can businesses, frankly. So we're going to get more regulation and legislation. We're going to get more business interest in those issues, because they're not going away. The science is there. It's difficult to argue against those sorts of things wherever you sit on the political spectrum, because we're all affected by the economy and what goes in it. I suppose, what complicates matters a little bit in relation to the sort of ESG backlash is that the press have picked up on some of the perhaps weak standards that do exist. I think there are some weaknesses out there, but in respect of ESG as an investment strategy, and the headline will say ESG X, Y, or Z, something negative. And actually what the article is talking about is a specific ESG investment strategy, not ESG in the round. And ESG will mean different things to different people. But I suppose those weaknesses do allow the press to publish negative headlines, and that really does fuel some of the backlash. But I don't think that backlash is going away either. I think we'll sort of rumble on like this, and risks will get greater, and we will see more change, and the backlash will also perhaps get stronger in some ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. And certainly we're feeling that here in the US. But, to your comments, these issues aren't going away. And they really are risk management issues for businesses, which all businesses should be concerned about, right? You can't.
Exactly.
I love the quote from Paul Pullman. He said, businesses cannot survive in societies that are failing, or planets that are burning or flooding or what have you. And so for long-term business viability, ESG has to be part of the risk decision matrix.
And I think Mark Carney said at the time of when COVID first exploded, you can't self-isolate from the risks of climate change and the effects that they have on the economy. So lots of great quotes, lots of great quotes covering that point.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I noticed that recently there was a publication on MacFarlane's website about competition law and antitrust issues and those sorts of things that are emerging or flourishing, shall we say, around industry ESG collaboration. Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I fed into that article, so thank you for mentioning it. However, my competition colleagues wrote most of it. It's a really topical point for us in the UK, and as you have just alluded to, we have had a bit of progress on that recently. The CMA, or the Competition and Markets Authority, they have produced this draft guidance note. So it's not official yet; it's still in draft. On their rules, which potentially relax the approach for climate change agreements. It does represent progress for us, but there is still quite a lot of work to do. So, for example, it specifically doesn't cover biodiversity-related agreements, which is a bit frustrating for someone like me. I am in lots of industry body working groups, and there is still concern. I think people will still be cognizant of potential risks for a while yet, even with some of these changes. But I think the direction of travel is going in the right direction. It's also just worth mentioning while we're on this point that the NZLA, the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, have a really good competition law working group. Ironically, is that a working group that should be worried about competition? But they're doing some great work in this area to progress things forward.
I was just going to ask you about some of the various groups of lawyers that are getting together to figure out how to move forward. And are they also subject to competition law restraints? And I'm so glad to hear that there's a committee of the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance working on this. That makes perfect sense. What do you think is the most important step that clients can take when they're just getting started on their ESG journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as a sort of overall point, I'd say that taking a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach is the right way to approach it. There are some examples that I've seen out there, not necessarily with our client base, but just more generally, where a business might decide to do something ESG related in a product or service line down at the bottom, but they don't say have an approved board strategy or climate competence or ESG competence within the board at sort of board level, and therefore the execution of it hasn't sort of flowed through very well. And we actually have a corporate advisory team of non-lawyers that do talk to boards and assess the sort of ESG appetite before they then work on their strategy. And and sort of that approach of sort of deciding at board level what the strategy is going to be before then implementing any sort of strategy or product or service, whatever they might be doing. I think is just a more successful approach and a direction of travel that people should be following.
Well, and it feeds into the idea that ESG is not a separate strategy from the business strategy.
Yes.
ESG is the strategy of the way the board makes its decisions, right? So it has to be at the top. It can't be a side project or something that a committee of employee volunteers does on a Saturday.
Yes, exactly. And some of the frameworks will come and help move that along. So, when you prepare a TCFD report, you have to look at the risks to your business and the opportunities. And TCFD reports are signed off by, people at the highest level. And so some of this, I hope, will get sort of worked through as well. But for a client approaching something ESG related, be it a whole strategy or isolated pieces of service or advice, or products, I think that top-down approach is definitely the right one to take.
Yeah, I agree. Let's flip to the other side of the coin with respect to a law firm's ESG practices and performance and policies, et cetera. Is MacFarlanes seeing increased client interest or dare I say pressure around ESG?
Yeah, definitely. It depends what sort of time horizon you're asking about. So I definitely think within the last 3 years, there has been a lot more requests from clients in relation to ESG and what we're doing about ESG in the firm. We will be asked to fill out the same sorts of questionnaires, the same sort of ESG ratings processes that all of our competitors will be asked to fill out. We fare pretty well with those. We don't pay to market our scores. You often have to pay to market them, and we choose not to. But at the moment, it's not pressure that we're unable to meet, and I think that probably is the same for other firms as well. And personally, I might have expected there to be actually more requests or the requests to become a little bit more difficult over time. I think that's probably just a reflection of the fact that everyone's working really hard in relation to ESG, and as you have already alluded to in this podcast, that there aren't actually enough personnel to actually cover some of the work that's required out there. So I think as procurement processes and people that procure law firm services become more upskilled themselves in relation to ESG, I think we're going to see more and more pressure coming through. And also the clients, once they have developed their ESG strategy and policies and procedures, and they are subject to more ESG regulation, that there will just be more frequent requests. And that will require firms also to add additional people to teams that are responding to those requests, unless we go down the sort of pure platform route where law firms just report through a platform and it's a single platform and everyone uses the same one. I mean, that would be, this sort of convergence would be ideal in some respects, but I think that's going to step up over time, actually.
I agree, and I do agree that will certainly make the reporting part easier. But to me, the reporting part is not the hard part. The hard part is building a robust, holistic program, because once that's in place, you're happy to do the reporting about it. I think when law firms don't have a holistic, robust program in place and they're trying to fill out these reporting requirements or audit and assessment tools, that's when it's challenging, because you don't have your ducks in a row, shall we say.
Yeah, and I suppose the more and more requests that come in will then trigger people to do it properly, I think, just more generally in the industry.
Yes.
I think you're right.
So what in the industry right now do you find encouraging? And then, of course, the other side of that question is going to be, what is discouraging to you?
Well, I think I'll start with discouraging to sort of end on the positive note. I suppose we've talked about the ESG backlash, and that is reasonably discouraging, because people will mention it to you when you're head of ESG. People will come and talk to you about it, and I suppose in some ways it's good to sort of it triggers the conversation, but that can feel a little bit discouraging sometimes. But I suppose I speak to people every day who are working very hard in relation to ESG, whatever that their version of ESG might be. And we had just very recently things like the IPCC synthesis report that came in that said that 1.5 is looking more and more out of reach as each day that passes, and we need to act really quickly. And it's just sad to see again on paper that actually emissions globally are increasing year on year, not decreasing. And so whilst I can see people working really genuinely really hard, things out there still feel like they're getting worse. And then there's the point that we've known about the climate science for more than 30 years, and it's still going up. So I suppose I find that bit discouraging. As human beings, we are highly intelligent, perhaps almost too intelligent, what we've been able to do on this planet. And I think we're better. I think we're better than this. So hopefully we can do what they suggest and act quickly. But I suppose I find that is relatively discouraging.
Yes.
Encouraging is just how much work is being done. And I suppose the change I've seen over the last few years in the sort of financial services industry, and the drive of different organizations and different groups to, I suppose, green the economy, and the desire from investors to invest actually in sort of green products, and the sort of the massive progress has been really significant there. And another encouraging thing, it's good to come up with two.
Yes.
Is that I run the MacFarlanes ESG commercial legal program that's for trainees, hopefully to create some ESG lawyers of tomorrow. And the enthusiasm there is pretty significant. And people talk about that all the time. But when you actually go to the meetings and talk to them, it's really encouraging to see how much interest and drive that generation actually has for ESG and ESG within the law as well.
So that that raises one more question I have for you. ESG lawyers of tomorrow. Do you really think there will be ESG lawyers, or are we going to get to a state where ESG is just the mindset and the lens through which all legal advice is given to clients? That's a question I ponder all the time. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that we will have an ESG lawyer of tomorrow. I also don't think that ESG lawyers exist today either.
Right.
Because I think, my background is as a finance lawyer. I am a finance lawyer with ESG expertise. I suppose so. Therefore, my best areas to talk about in relation to ESG are ESG in financial markets. Great. I can do that. I can do that pretty well. Talk to me about, say, establishing a wind farm. I am probably not the right person to talk to. Talk to me about human rights. I know a bit about human rights as it relates to ESG, but I think to find a single person that every aspect of ESG they are an expert in is, first of all, asking too much of that person, and second of all, would be humanly, I think, impossible. And the other thing is that because ESG is always adapting and evolving, and that's one of the great things about ESG is it isn't defined. That comes with lots of problems that we've sort of covered in this podcast around people thinking it's something different to what it is. But it will keep flexing and adapting, and there will be brand new things that come within the ESG bucket that we don't even know about yet, because they will evolve and it will come under the umbrella of ESG. So the answer is no, but I suppose I would like to think that the lawyers of tomorrow will have all these different ESG skills to add in alongside whatever practice area that they are going to go into, and sort of have those skills alongside what they are going to go into, and the sort of areas of advice that they advise on. So it depends. If you think that is an ESG lawyer, then maybe the answer is yes. But it's a great question and subject to debates on all sides, I think.
Yes. Well, it's related to we're running out of time. So my final question is related to that. If I'm fortunate enough to have you back a year from now to talk to us again on this podcast, what will have changed in that year's time?
Definitely more regulation, and I think the sort of the additional point on from more regulation is more junior ESG roles in every single organization. So just more people to process data requests, to deal with the different frameworks and the reporting. And it's going to be challenging to fill those roles, but I think there will be a wave of junior ESG professionals, notwithstanding everything that that we've already talked about in the podcast. And some of those frameworks that I feel like we've been talking about for ages will hopefully be actually here and reportable against, or maybe on the cusp of being. So things like the ISSB standard that the IFRS are working on, and the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures as well. And I would hope, and this is a sort of personal wish of mine, is that we can open up ecosystem markets a little bit more and have more, or I suppose additional investable financial products that can drive a bit more capital to where it's needed, but at the same time to provide the sort of guaranteed return that a certain type of investor requires, that really unlocks the capital that everyone says that we need. So I think there's some work to do there that is possible to be done within the next year. And then to go back to actually a point that we've already discussed briefly, is that ESG might start disappearing as a term a little bit. And I don't see that as a bad thing. It might mean that people use terms properly. So, use of the word ESG as a prefix to a fund name, ESG fund, what is that? No one really knows. People are clearer about, say, what an impact fund is. And so I think a little bit more clarity in describing what people actually mean when they use terms might well mean that the term ESG is used less. Or it could just mean that all of the risks associated with ESG have just completely fallen away, and therefore we live in a perfect world and we've fixed all of the world's problems. That's very unlikely. Or it could mean, to go back to the point that you referred to earlier, is that ESG risk is just completely integrated within every risk assessment out there, and therefore it is unnecessary to use the term because it just is the term risk. So I don't know, I think it probably will be used a little bit less, and I don't see that as a bad thing. Despite the fact that I'm head of ESG, you might think that I'd want the term to stick around for a long time, but it might provide actually a little bit more clarity when people are having discussions about ESG.
Well, I completely agree, and I hope to have you back a year from now, and we will play this part of the podcast to see how much of your predictions have come true. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rachel. I'm sure the audience has found it incredibly interesting and engaging, and we'll talk to you again in 1 year.
Thanks, Pam.